Well, first, before I jump in, I would say, thank you all for this wonderful opportunity to have this chat, and really excited to be here with Dr. Kinghorn and to learn more. This is, of course, the question about how you end up in psychiatry is an interesting one for me because it was quite a roundabout, really field of choice. This is where I would say, God definitely has a plan for you in all aspects, and I was not one who actually ever thought I'd be in this field. I had a completely different plan in mind. I didn't know that I wanted to be a physician, and my work, uh, you know, proceeds in medicine, in that I had actually first, completed some work in what we would call divinity studies. So I had traveled to Damascus, Syria. The picture behind me, actually, the screen is from Damascus, and had spent some time studying Islam formally, classically, in which I was trained in that. And when I returned back to the US, had been formally teaching and working in the community, as a faith leader and one who was teaching. And in the meantime, I was quite young, I would say. So in the meantime, I was also pursuing my college studies and my medical school studies, and really thought that I was going to enter the world of women's health. I really thought I would become an obstetrician. And in the process of all of this, especially in working with the community and teaching actively and working with the community, what became really clear to me is that there was a number of concerns. I didn't know exactly what I would call them. Today, I would call them mental health concerns, that there weren't really very good answers to, as much as I was able to answer questions from, faith and from scripture, and really be able to give from what I had been trained in. There was still a missing element, and I felt out of my depth really to help from what would be today I would call mental health or kind of psychological concerns. That led me to shift paths very, very close to the end of my medical training. And so close to the end of it, this is where the kind of humorous part of it is, that all my letters of recommendation still read that I was going into obstetrics. And so when I went into my psychiatry residency interviews, it was quite humorous, actually, because I had people asking me, which of the two fields are you planning to go into? So I had just sort of changed plans in the nick of time, but really it was God planning all the way through. Something about having been trained in, kind of my religious studies first, and then being able to bridge that with the psychiatric training was very powerful, I think, particularly in speaking about stigma, about mental health, and really accessing, being able to access the community in a way that otherwise was difficult to access. And I had that, trust, if you will, in the community already preceding the work I was doing. So when mental health came in to the picture, I just sort of added that into what I was doing, kind of bridged the two worlds together. So for me, it's been a really interesting process. Not a path that I had actually ever envisioned earlier in my life. I always joke that I never taken a single psychology course in college because I had my own internalized stigma against this field, actually. So it's been interesting, and that's a little bit about my backstory.
Yeah, first of all, thank you all for inviting us tonight. It's really an honor to be here with Dr. Awaad, and thanks to Julia and Maliha for hosting us, and for all of you who are attending. And my story has actually a lot of parallels in many ways. I did not always think that I was going to be a psychiatrist, and my being a psychiatrist actually has a lot to do with my faith. I did major in psychology as an undergraduate, unlike Dr. Awaad, but when I got to medical school, the way that psychiatry was taught in my first 2 or even 3 years was just really uninteresting to me in many ways. That we learned DSM criteria sets and then had to regurgitate them on tests, and even the neurobiological things we were shown just didn't seem to resonate with the kind of experiences of the people that I was working with. And so I decided I was going to go into internal medicine or primary care. And then I left medical school for 2 years to study in a divinity school here at Duke, and to study Christian theology and practice and history. And in that context, I began to just see everything in a broader context. And I had my own experience of therapy, which was really helpful at a really hard time. I saw therapy be helpful for other people. But I also, as I began to dig into my own Christian faith tradition, I began to see how there was this rich language of carrying our sufferings to God. And Psalm 88, which is this psalm of real despair, you have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths. Your wrath lies heavily upon me. You've overwhelmed me with all your waves. And I began to see like, wow, this is a really rich account of like what it means to suffer. And then I began to learn more about how Jewish and Christian writers were writing in those years about what it means to feel, what it means to be in a relationship, what it means to grieve. I began to learn more about the way that early Christians began to like think about these things, and I kind of realized that psychiatry, really modern medicine, is about 200 years old in its modern form. Psychiatry is about 130 or so years old, but this faith tradition that I was learning is 2,000 plus years old, and there's so much depth and richness to it. And that helped me to see, when I got back to medical school to finish up, that helped me just to see things in a different and new way. So I began not to like force people into boxes as like machines that needed fixing, but I began to see people in the context of stories, and I began to realize that like I could do that. And I had a older psychiatrist in medical school who counseled me that that as a psychiatrist, to look at a person as a whole person, and to look at that person in their context of their family and their community and their relationships, and for you to really attend to that person as a whole person, like that's your job, that's what you're there to do. And that was really appealing to me, and it really resonated with my personal faith and with what I've been studying. And I also decided in psychiatry at like the very last minute, almost too late, but I did, and I haven't looked back since.
A nice commonality there. Kind of funny that you both came into it close to the very end. I'm applying into OBGYN. I still have time to switch, so
That's right.
it could happen. Well, great. Thanks for your answers to that question. Our next one is a little bit more broad and maybe a little bit more personal, but we kind of want to dive into the topic of this webinar and ask you about how you've dealt with stigma in your religious circles around your work, and if you've felt that there, and if so, what kind and how did you respond to that kind of stigma? And then additionally, just invite you to converse with one another about maybe common experiences, or sharing like that happened to me too, or this is different from what I've experienced. Yeah.
Dr. King, would you like to go first?
Sure, I can take that one first. Yeah.
Well,
certainly I have encountered stigma. As Dr. Awaad said, I've encountered it in myself, for one thing, and then I've also encountered it in just the culture at large, and also in Christian culture and Christian communities. I think when I think about stigma, there's lots of ways to think about stigma, but there's at least two ways which can show up in Christian contexts. Like one is a kind of anti-psychiatry stigma, that like the idea that like if you're struggling, like maybe it's okay to see a pastor, or a priest. It might be okay to see a Christian counselor or a spiritual director, but it's not okay to see like a secular psychologist or psychiatrist. And that comes out of, I think, stereotypes of what psychiatry was like at the time of Freud and the early behaviorists. And I think the way I'd respond to that as a Christian is just to say that psychiatry, the field, is just not pervasively like that anymore. It's not a pervasively anti-religious field where like people are trying to get you not to believe. This is not true. That there's a lot of psychiatrists of faith. I think that both of us here who are psychiatrists are count in that category. There's a lot of others who aren't people of faith, but who really believe that faith is a good thing, and who want people to be able to claim their faith in healthy ways. And so I just say, like, try it out. And there's a verse in the New Testament letter of 1 Thessalonians that says, "Test everything and hold fast to what's good." And I think that we can do that as Christians with psychiatry. We can when we're struggling, we can go and seek help from others and test everything and hold fast to what's good. So there's nothing to fear in that way. And then I think the other kind of stigma is more like just it's the stigma that attends to struggling and to living with mental illness. And in I don't think this is uniquely Christian, but in Christian circles, it basically has to do with some kind of belief that if you were just faithful enough, if you just prayed hard enough, if you just believed the right things, if you just like went to the right communities, then things would work out for you and you wouldn't be unable to get things together and to struggle. And so that leaves us like when we're not doing well and when like can't seem to just get it together, and we or like there's just things that just are constantly happening that we don't think we can control, or we're having experiences that we can't seem to control. It creates this intense feeling of shame, like it must just be me. It's not like it's not other. It's just like I'm what's wrong. And so like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden in the story in the book of Genesis, like we're hiding trying to keep from being found out, and that just makes suffering worse. And so when I think about how, as a Christian, I would respond to that, specifically thinking about Christian faith and tradition, I'd say a few things. One, I would just say that the deepest truth of who we are is that we are loved and known by God. And there's nothing more central to our lives than that we are known and loved by God. I think I also would cling to Psalm 88 and other Psalms like Psalm 13. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts? These Psalms teach us that rather than hiding from God or hiding from others when we struggle, we can carry those struggles and sufferings to God. And Christians also believe that Jesus, who Christians believe to be God, knows those struggles, bears those struggles, identifies with those struggles. And there's this really kind of odd verse in the Gospel of Mark in the New Testament where Jesus was in his hometown. He was preaching to his local community, and this verse in Mark says that they went out to restrain him, for they said that he was out of his mind. And I'm always breathtaken by that verse, because it doesn't say that Jesus had what we now consider mental illness. It doesn't say that, but it does say that he knew what it meant for others, the people who knew him the longest and who loved him the most, and who were to say, you need to be restrained. You're somehow dangerous to this community. And if Jesus knew that, and Jesus throughout his life and ministry would draw close to people who were struggling and who were on the outs and who were marginalized and who were sick and who were broken, and not ostracize them, but attend them and touch them and heal them and bring them into community, then that's a model for us to follow, and we can do that. And then if the church is doing what it's supposed to be doing, which is to be the body of Christ, living into that mission of Jesus, then we would actually want to carry one another's burdens, not shame people who are burdening or who have burdens, but just as the New Testament book of Galatians says, to bear one another's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the law of Christ. And so whereas in our American culture, and I think in American Christian culture, there's often the sense of I don't want to be a burden to anyone else. I just want to have my stuff together. I think Christian faith at its best, I think, says you ought to be a burden. That's what it means to be human, is we are burdens to each other. And to be a burden is actually a gift. And that's what I want to try to claim.
I would say there's so many different parallels to exactly what you brought up, Dr. Kinghorn, and honestly, the if we start from the internalized stigma to begin with, I think I shared how that was definitely something I held, and so much so that I didn't take the single course in psychology in college, because I literally said to myself, "What good Muslim girl takes psychology courses? That's just about Freud and his goons. I mean, really, what is this? It has nothing and no bearing to Muslims." Only, of course, and this is where God humbles you, but only in time, kind of to realize that there was an incredibly rich history with Islam and mental health, which I'm going to hopefully share in just momentarily. But my own struggles with this is exactly how you outlined it. There's an internalized bias against this field. There was definitely a community-based bias in that, when you think about how so many in the Muslim community feel exactly how you described, that if a person was struggling, should they have enough faith, they should be able to get through everything and anything. And having any sort of dependence, including seeking out the kind of care that we today would say, therapy, go to therapy, go talk to a counselor, talk to somebody. And then culturally, this concept of airing your dirty laundry, right? In many cultures, this is not from the faith whatsoever, but for many cultures, that are, part of the Muslim faith, that definitely is, and I would say this extends beyond the Muslim community as well, that's definitely a barrier. And it has always been. I mean, this is something I grew up with, and I know many have grown up with. So the concept of psychology altogether was so foreign, if you will. And I struggled with that too, even professionally coming into this field of how could I really bridge this, what seemed like a big gap, just really difficult to bridge. And some of the work that I did, because I was already kind of, a faith leader in the community, did quite a bit of teaching and lecturing and whatnot. And I started when I was still in residency, psychiatry residency, just sort of sneaking it in is the best way to explain it. So I'd be invited to give a talk, let's say to a group of women at the mosque, and it would be about, preparing for the month of Ramadan or something like that, very kind of innocuous, very much on a spiritual part of the discussion. And in the midst of it, I would say something about mental health. I'd kind of literally sneak it in there because that's how much it was so difficult to have that conversation outright. I had heard in that same local mosque here in our area that they had tried once to put an event together that actually said the words mental health on it in the description. And one person showed up. And then they had to literally take out, kind of like, recruit people from the hallways and say, hey, we have an event, come on in. And I think they got a total of 2. So that made it very clear to me early on. That's not something I can do very easily and clearly. So this is how it started. And then I would kind of, this was the point in my own trajectory where I was saying to myself, as Muslim kids growing up, we're often very proud of this Muslim heritage that we have. We hear about kind of these golden ages in which there was lots of great developments in science and medicine, in the humanities, but I had never once ever heard anything related to mental health. And and then I really struggled with this. And I thought, look, I have all this classical training. I studied primary texts in the original Arabic and so on. I wonder what the books say for themselves of the early Muslim predecessors. And that led to a whole research. That's actually what led me into the whole field of research in the first place. But I started to pull out a lot of primary texts and actually look at what early Muslim predecessors wrote about this. Because I thought, they couldn't have made all those advancements in medicine and in surgery that say nothing about mental health. And what I found, which was really fascinating, was that as they would describe the human body, even just anatomically speaking, they would start with the head and kind of go all the way to the toes. And very quickly within these books, it became very clear, even if it wasn't called psychology, which that term didn't exist then, there was absolutely the understanding of wellness in what today we would call brain health, if you will, right? And that one thing led to another, and it became very clear to me that not only was there a discussion on why was it there in the books, because there was the Islamic worldview is one that talks about health in a very holistic manner. This concept of mind, body, and soul is very much part of the Islamic teachings and very much reflected in the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and in the Quran. And when you look at what that meant, how it translated over into actual theory, so actually, scholars that are writing theoretically about what today we would actually call psychology, but also in institutions. So it translated over into institutional work. So what does that mean? And many people don't know this little piece of trivia, I think. And this is where, I was amazed and really surprised, and I get very passionate about speaking about this, that the first of the psychiatric wards that we see kind of in human history, if you will, shows up in the Muslim world. It shows up in these hospitals that had entire wards that were dedicated to the treatment of mental health and mental wellness. And that was fascinating to me. So not only was there, the surgery units and the, where you work with, I don't know, anything that's any other organ of the body or health, but there was also the mental health piece of it. And so therefore there were also treatments and discussion of diagnoses and classifications of illness. And the beginnings of the discussions on talk therapy. I mean, this all just blew me away. Just where was all of this discussion growing up? None of it, was very prevalent or existent. And that let me, this is what I was basically sneaking into my lectures, if you will. And so I would kind of, drop a couple of, discussions and say, hey, did you know? And how about this or that? And that would just sort of, I could see in the crowd, the audience was just sort of taken aback, really? Just kind of fascinated. And I think one thing led to another. And as the years went along, I would also say that in general, even here in our American society, the discussion on mental health has also changed over time, where it's now much more okay to talk about this. And there are folks who are, celebrities, athletes, et cetera, who are coming out and actually saying, I struggle with mental health issues and I see a therapist, right? And so what does that do? It kind of translates into the society of the permissibility, if you will, of talking about this and realizing that you're not deficient if there's something happening on the mental health field, from the mental health concerns. And for the faith communities, it's been really interesting too, because it's also kind of given the sense that you can talk about this. It's just been a very interesting process, really, from going from sneaking it into lectures to now developing a whole conversation around this, or even now being able to title lectures that are being given or talks or so on in the community and actually include the word mental health very visibly. So it's been a real change, I would say, over time. And I think drawing very similar to yourself, Dr. Kinghorn, kind of drawing on my own tradition and its heritage, and kind of being able to quote verses from the Quran or from the Hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, to be able to say, yes, this is part of our tradition. And here's the proof in the pudding of how this wasn't just something they just spoke about or theorized about, but actually built out whole institutions of healing around this concept. And that's really been a game changer, I would say.
Yeah, first of all, I really appreciate your historical work and the way that you talk about the history of health and especially mental health in Islam, and I've learned from that, and I think that it's something that's really helped me is this knowledge that both Christians and I don't want to speak for Muslims, but Christians never had their own. The early Christians never had their own unique like practice of medicine that was totally distinct from what had come before. But they tried to draw on the best of Galen and what was considered kind of the best practices of the medicine of their day. But they put these unique stamps on it. They would see the person who's sick not just as to be cared for because they were part of the military or because they were part of a household that had a certain status, but the person who was sick like bore the image of God and so needed to be cared for as Jesus himself. And that led to some of these early monastic institutions that you can kind of trace the history of the charity hospital to. But I also love how in the Middle Ages, like, so even Sina, who's a great Muslim scholar in the 11th century or 12th century, wrote a book called The Canon of Medicine that was used all over the Middle East and North Africa and the Christian and Latin Christian Europe until like the 1800s or something like that, in 1700s. And so you had this in a time when we often think of as like kind of just skip over it in medical history. There were Christian scholars and Jewish scholars like Maimonides and Muslim scholars who were reading each other and who were all drawing on Galen and on Aristotle and on classical thought. And it was this incredibly rich matrix. And modern medicine emerged from that matrix. It didn't just skip over it. It emerged from it. And it's helped me to know that and to think about that.
Absolutely. I would have to say this concept of what I'm calling kind of a rewriting the narrative, I think is so important because I struggled with that question of like, where is this discussion of psychology, mental health, psychiatry, where is this in my own faith tradition? And realizing that unfortunately what was available, at least in the English language, had definitely left out. Sometimes, I mean, historically, I would say accidentally, like it's just not translated into the English language, therefore it's not accessible. And sometimes it feels a little purposeful, honestly, which is a different discussion than we have time for today. But there's definitely the sense of, needing or feeling this need to make sure that we rewrite things and make sure that the narrative actually fits historically what is accurate, because then you're at this point, you can really break down some of the stigma that exists in the community of saying, look, this is a Western construct. This whole field of psychology, this is a Western construct. It has nothing to do with us. We have other ways of coping and healing, and rather rewrite the narrative and say, no, actually, this is very much part of the heritage and the legacy that is left, that is from kind of for the Muslim community, we're talking about from the Islamic tradition. And this is very much part of your heritage and legacy. Yes, European psychology, the way it emerged, when we're talking about the 19th century, that may not feel as connected to you, but the discussion on mental wellness and well-being absolutely is. And here, let's try to rewrite this narrative more authentically. So yes, I very much hear what you're saying.
And I resonate with what you're saying about us mentioning mental health and having one person come or two people come. I've experienced that in churches too. And I've also experienced like the conversation getting started, and then all of a sudden people start to feel like it's safe to talk about, so they'll start to share their own experiences. And in my Christian congregation a few years ago, I in a church that almost never talked about mental health in public, just gave people an opportunity to share their own stories. And I had people calling me that I had no idea, saying, could I come and talk about my experience of living with an eating disorder and finding healing there? And could my friend come with me who went through this with me together? And could my husband and I talk about our experience of finding ourselves drinking too much and really struggling with that and finding healing? And or could we talk about grief? And it's just amazing to me how much, once people had a chance to talk, it was right there. And I just always want to just encourage that, because it felt really healthy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment on that. I feel like sometimes in religious communities, it feels like religion happens in a vacuum. Religion and faith happen in a vacuum. And, if you're experiencing something like an eating disorder or, another condition like depression or all these things that are very common that happened outside and totally apart from your religious life. And I feel like whenever it's brought up in church or in a religious space, at least in my experience, there's so much like Me Too that happens in that moment, which to me is so empowering, right? Because sort of like you had said before, Dr. Kinghorn, that one of the biggest tenets of Christianity is that healing comes from bringing things into the light and not keeping them sort of hidden in the darkness of your own soul or your own mind, because healing comes from, the love of Christ kind of entering into those spaces. And so I think that's a really beautiful, wonderful story. And I wish that would happen more, because I think we think of the church as a building and as a space as being like impenetrable and kind of this like building on the hill where nothing dirty or bad can happen. And actually that's the safest place for those things to kind of find the light.
And you're absolutely right. That's how the church can feel. And it's such a tragedy that that's the case, because that's not the way it ought to be. And I both recognize that and lament that. This isn't really, I don't think this is a religious image so much, but I think of this phenomenon of shame and stigma. Like it's like being enclosed in a turret with like a thick wall around, and there's a little passageway, but there's a sentry on the inside that's called shame, and there's a sentry on the outside that's called stigma, and they work together. And shame keeps you from leaving, and stigma tries to keep others from entering, and it keeps people isolated. And to be isolated is to be alone and to be away from relationship, and participates in death and not in life. And I think a lot of our faith traditions would call for connection and not isolation, and that is really important. Yeah, all to say, yes, I agree with that.
Also, just to add, Julia, to your point, I think there's kind of a similarity, and Dr. Awaad kind of had mentioned this, but Islam is essentially like a lifestyle religion, right? And so it's part of everything that we do in our faith, in our school, or with our health. And I feel like sometimes people don't make those connections. So I'm really grateful, especially Dr. Awaad did a series with Yaqeen Institute that focuses on the history of mental health and how our health is connected to our faith, and just realizing that faith is a part of every aspect of our lives. And so I'm grateful for seeing the progress that we've kind of have made, like you guys have mentioned, from it being so stigmatized to being able to have these discussions now. I do want to move us along, though, to our next question, which was, how have you built meaningful and long-lasting connections with people outside of your faith, and what have you gained from those relationships? Anyone can start.
First, Dr. Awaad.
Sure, I can start. Yes, definitely. And I think it's been really important actually to have that, because I'll say two things to this. One is that in working with my own community, right, there's so much work to do that honestly, it could be very, you could probably spend your entire life and career kind of working only within only within your faith and only within your community or communities that you're a part of. And what I found incredibly meaningful actually is finding others. And sometimes it's hard to find. I don't know, maybe Duke it's different, but at Stanford here in the Californian and the West Coast, it's different. It's hard. It's been hard to find folks who are willing to very openly say that they're a person of faith, particularly in the field that I'm in psychiatry, and that we are both in, I should say. And it's so it's been challenging. And when you do find that, it's been really gratifying because there's really a sense of a connection and similarity, very much as we're covering today. And I would also say the field of, or the discussion around mental health, being that it's kind of starting to open up more and more in other faith communities as well, it's been really interesting for me being asked to speak and teach and train outside of the Muslim community. So I've done a number of trainings for priests and pastors on the topic of mental health and on the topic of clergy burnout, for example. And it's been really interesting being the hijab wearing woman at the front of the church, right? Speaking to all the priests and pastors. And interestingly enough, there have been times in which those trainings have led to, and this is not, of course, me alone, this is a whole series of events that happen all together, but seeing some really phenomenal changes within the folks that I've trained essentially and in the churches that they lead. And to find that, I've had a couple of, leaders who have decided that their congregation is going to have mental health discussions or have mental health time off. I've had pastors who've actually said to their own congregants that they themselves are going to take some mental health time off and kind of lead by example in that way, and institute, in one case, in one denomination, actually start to have a mental health clinic, I guess is the best way to call it, right across from where the church would be. These are all very new things, and they've been incredible things to really see and hear and find them. And really, I feel very honored to really have been part of that catalyst of change. And it's not within my own faith tradition, but there is a similar connection here of being people of faith, communities of faith, and those kind of friendships and relationships have been really incredible, because sometimes, and I find this even within my own community, when it comes from within, sometimes it's harder to listen to. And when it's coming from outside of that, sometimes it's easier to really take that in. And so it's been a very neat journey, I would say. And I'm just so glad to see the needle starting to shift. We still have a long way to go. I don't want to paint this all rosy. We still have a very long way to go, but the needle is shifting, and it's been really great to keep that going forward. To be part of that, I would say.
I would echo that. So, I'm a Christian, which is the majority faith tradition in the U.S. numerically, and I'm a middle-aged white male Christian, and we live in this pretty like polarized society where it would be pretty easy for me to just kind of only see other white Christians in the world that I live in. And one of the things I love about being in medicine. I work in an academic medical center, as do all of us here on the screen right now. And one of the things I love about medicine is that it puts people from really different backgrounds and traditions, and from all over the world, and from lots of different faith backgrounds and none, and together in this common cause of caring for the sick. And I just think that's really amazing. I love that about the fact that at Duke, every year we get this amazing class of incoming residents and students, medical and PA students that come and rotate with us, and colleagues that come in from, and I've learned so much in those relationships. I've been so blessed by it, and I think the way that as a Christian I've learned from just a couple of little anecdotes. One is for a while I was scheduling a half day of teaching for the psychiatry residents each year, and I learned that there were a couple of faculty that were just very observant, as in a way that I just I needed to learn about the need not to schedule things on the Jewish high holy days, and to really respect that, and to respect that even though Duke and the state doesn't consider that a holiday, and to see that these colleagues were like willing to give up a lot in order to be observant on those days. And another more recent example, we have a really amazing resident who just graduated from our program. She gave me permission to use her name. Hira Salat is a very faithful, observant Muslim woman who takes her faith very seriously. And even though I teach at the divinity school at Duke, and I was organizing this curriculum for the psychiatry residents, this overall curriculum didn't really have a lot of content around spirituality and religion and faith. Not really intentionally, but I was just like, well, I've got to teach a bunch of stuff in a psychiatry residency. And Hira came to me, and I think probably her second year of residency, and she's like, Dr. Kinghorn, like, why is there nothing about spirituality in this curriculum? Like, there needs to be something there. And I was like, I don't know, like, I just never gotten put in. And she's like, well, there needs to be something in here on spirituality. So we got a small internal grant, and it got delayed by COVID, but just this March, we had this really lovely symposium on spirituality, religion, and psychiatry that brought together healthcare chaplains from a variety of faith traditions and also racial ethnic backgrounds, interfaith community leaders and clinicians from Duke and its associated institutions to just talk about, like, how do we think about taking a spiritual history, and how do we learn from each other, and how can we draw on each other, and how can clinicians link to the work of chaplains and faith leaders around the care of patients. And to me, that was a really life-giving conversation. And it honestly probably would not have happened had Hira not been like, Dr. Kinghorn, why are you not doing anything about this in our program? And so I think that's an example where my Muslim colleague like prodded me to like be more open about my Christian faith in a kind of curriculum context in the medical center. And so I think that I've not only like grown in relationship, but I've grown in my own faith in the kinds of relationships that have formed. So I've been blessed by that.
Yeah, so part of the reason that these questions were sort of at the center of our minds was, you know, Maliha and I are classmates, so we've been together for the last 3 years, and we'll be together for 1 more year. But I would say probably around second year. I don't know. I remember there was one experience that we had together at the beginning of clinical year. I say together, I was just there with her when it happened with Maliha, that kind of, for me, like catapulted this conversation in just like, really as clinicians, how do we create spaces and environments that are not just, you know, I think the buzzword right now is tolerant, but are like genuinely curious and passionate about each other and about understanding people and their backgrounds and what they believe, and making them feel comfortable in any environment. And then I think kind of over the year that evolved into a little bit more of like actual curiosity about, okay, like I want to understand more about what you believe and where you come from, and sort of all these different things. So that's kind of where we're coming from with this. And we have several questions that were submitted to the form, the registration form, and I think one of them goes really well with what both of you just talked about. So one of the questions we got was, how do we, and or you both being experts in this, ground spiritual identities and advocate for students in sort of a secular space? And that can be students or residents. But yeah, Dr. Awaad, I really resonated with you talking about it being hard to find people who will like proclaim their faiths kind of loudly. And I think that's intimidating different ways for students of faith and then for faculty of faith. And so I'm sure there's like different dynamics there. And so it's hard for sort of both groups to reconcile with that. But yeah, we're just wondering, how do you, and then by you know, continuation, how do we create space and advocate for students of any faith in secular spaces like medicine often tends to be?
Yep, definitely. I would say I'll start here with the Muslim community first and give that as kind of a case example, especially because it's no surprise, I think, to anybody that the last, several years here, I would say, particularly the last 5 years, have been very, very challenging for the Muslim community here in the US. You know, the introduction of the Muslim ban, for example, and how that has affected so many of our students on campus and others, of course, in the community. Just the kind of the rhetoric, the anti-Muslim rhetoric and Islamophobic, you know, rhetoric, and unfortunately, which continues. I mean, we see just last couple of weeks ago, you know, an entire family kind of mowed down just because they were Muslim. It's really hard. And what that's meant then for, let's say, students on campus in an academic secular space, to feel that they're invisible and to feel that they need more support and help. And this is where that kind of intersection with mental health comes in, because how do you advocate for the kind of resources that are needed that are, and I'll use this word, culturally congruent and spiritually sound for that particular community. So we talk about cultural competence, or you use the word tolerance. I'm not a fan of either of those words. I think congruency is a completely different ballgame altogether. How are you, you know, congruent with that faith and authentic to it, particularly when we talk about spiritual paths as well. And so part of what happened, I would say, on our campus is there aren't any. There continues to not actually be any Muslim therapists in our CAPS, our, you know, counseling psychological services office. And I'm sort of the lone, if you will, token Muslim therapist. I mean, so a psychiatrist in this case that's on campus, yeah, at that time at least. And it was interesting actually doing the advocacy work to say, look, there really needs to be. Interestingly, it actually happened first through our Office of Religious and Spiritual Life. That's where there was this is where I say you need to be creative. You know, for me, that's where I started. They asked me to come forward and help counsel some of the students. And because of my dual training, it allowed for that, right? So there's been times where, and I continue today, I'm actually the affiliate chaplain on campus. And last year I was the interim chaplain. So all the different, I like to call them the different hijabs I wore on my campus, you know, outside of the School of Medicine. And so it's been really interesting, actually. Sometimes it worked within our Office of Religious and Spiritual Life, and sometimes it was through our CAPS, you know, office, and other times it was through the Department of Psychiatry, and just which way to make sure that there were services available. But that led to a number of different things. We finally now have, as of a couple months ago, a Muslim chaplain full-time who's part of the university. And, you know, we have now a program we hope to roll out that would actually help address the mental health needs specifically for Muslim students on campus. And it's been a long time. So my main recommendation is creativity, be creative. My second recommendation is consistency. Like, this is where that squeaky wheel gets the grease actually plays out, of saying, look, this isn't abating anytime soon. Like, it's still, you know, our students are still very much feeling like they're marginalized and their voices aren't heard and they need some extra support. And the third part of this would be, in my case, you know, I'll just backstory this really, really quickly. I'd say when I was going through my residency interviews, I was told what I thought was one of those questions where they kind of trip you up for residency. Well, and this, I don't think that was. I actually think this was pretty overt, you know, bias. But I had somebody say to me, you know, psychiatrists need to be a blank slate, and you're anything but that. What are you going to do about that hijab? Or that thing on your head is basically what was said, you know. And I thought, my goodness gracious, you know, I don't have anything to do with this campus. But it's been an interesting journey since, and you know, as in my case, I didn't have the choice, nor do I want to have nor do I want to not proclaim loudly who I am and what I am and what I believe in. And not only am I a Muslim psychiatrist who wears a hijab and does kind of bread and butter psychiatry, my work is very much, you know, all about faith and all about spirituality and all about Muslim mental health. So there's no escaping that. But to find others who don't have to be sort of as loud as I am, if you will, but are willing to actually be, the word here is allyship, right? Kind of find the kind of allies who are willing to say, yeah, faith is important. It makes sense. It's something that definitely some folks, particularly those of the faith community, draw support from. So why not actually make space for that? Is really important too, because you can't do this work by yourself. You do need to find either people who are also members of faith, even if they're of other faith groups, or people who are of no faith, but at least understand that this is something that folks can draw support from. They're willing to support that effort, because you can't do this work alone. So those three aspects, I think, are really key. and that's been part of my own journey, continues to be. That's really what I would recommend as well for those who want to further that kind of support on in their spaces, campuses, etc.
I would answer that not with disagreement, but just in a different perspective. I agree with everything that Dr. Awaad said about Islamophobia and anti-Muslim violence, which we've seen here in North Carolina as well, and how that affects students and trainees and others. When I first heard that question, I was thinking about that possibly it had to do with a student from a deep faith tradition that feels like their faith is just not welcome in the medical space, like that they just like don't know how to be who they are religiously in the context of medicine. And your description of that, what was said to you, Dr. Awaad, was like a visceral like example of that. Like basically you're not welcome. What I tell Christian students who come, and this doesn't happen that often. I think Duke as a whole is, I think, a pretty hospitable place to religious particularity, both in the university and in the medical center, but there are certainly hiccups to that. What I tell students is that, first of all, like, it's a gift that you're here. Like, it's good that you're here in all of your particularity, and that's not just Christian students, that's students with any deeply held religious faith and commitment. And that your tradition has things to offer to your practice. And so what does it mean to bring that in a healthy and full way to the work that you do in the care of the sick? And I tell Christian students that that one really important thing is just transparency and honesty and truthfulness. So for example, I tell trainees and students that, like, anything that you do in a clinical situation, especially in like outpatient situations where you might not always be observed in what you're doing, or inpatient units where, like, people might be wondering if they should pray with patients or other things. I just say anything that you do, you ought to be willing for your attending, your supervisor, to fully know about, like, and to be able to give a public account of that. And if you're not willing to give that public account, you probably may, in this particular case, ought to think about not doing it, just because that's what it means to live with integrity and transparency. And I also, and then within that, though, I encourage people just to be to not hide who they are, and to be able to give reasons, and to be able to ask for what they need for religious accommodations and that kind of thing, because I think that's the kind of culture that we want to be forming. Another thing that I advise students on, and it's mostly Christian students who have conversations with about this, but is like, how does your Christian faith enrich, like, what do you bring to medicine that isn't a matter of like superiority over others, but how is it a strength that you can draw in, rather than you feeling like it's some kind of a liability or, like, badge that you have to worry about, and to get people to think about that. And I mean, for me, it's kind of this broader perspective. I mean, humans are wayfarers in need of attending rather than machines in need of fixing. Like, that to me is not an exclusively theological statement, but it's something that really, like, is deeply drawn from my faith. I think the question, like, if you're working in an ER and it's 2 a.m. and I'll just say a man comes in who's there for the 30th time in 45 days and intoxicated and cursing, and the staff is like totally burnt out, and like, this person's here again, and you're the one that's going to go to see him. Like, what does it mean to stand in front of that person and to see him or her as someone whom God loves, and someone who's worthy of your care and should be treated with dignity? And like, the best intentions for medical professionalism can wear thin in that moment. You sometimes need a deeper well to draw from. And for me, I can draw that from my faith, and to say, this is someone who bears the image of God and whom God loves more than I can imagine. And if God loves this person, then I should too, even if it's 2 a.m. and I'm tired, and it's the 30th presentation in 45 days. And also that there's hope. And even if I don't feel hope for this person, or they don't feel hope for themselves, I can carry hope from another. Like, I can basically say, like, I don't quite know how to feel hope here, but I know that God loves this person, and there's a possible better future ahead. And so I'm going to act toward that. So that's one example of how, like, our faith can matter for the work that we do in medicine, and in ways that I think can actually make us, like, better clinicians, better doctors, better psychologists, whatever. And then if that's the way that we that we act and live, then when we start to speak in very particular ways to say, this is why this is the case for me, then then others say, oh, like I noticed that, that Dr. Awaad was this incredibly dedicated psychiatrist, and I now know the broader context in which this is the case. And I just think that that's the way to go. It doesn't mean that there's never going to be problems or people that have their own biases that just sometimes have to just acknowledge and deal with. But I think there's often ways to turn this commitment into a real strength.
Yeah, thanks to you both. This is definitely something that's been on my mind and Maliha's mind and many of my friends of different faiths. Another question that we had pre-submitted that I have a special interest in is, how can we understand the humility of those who are agnostic? And part of my interest in this just comes from, I think the medical space lends itself particularly to being agnostic, just because, at least in my experience, I see really great things happen and I see really awful things happen. And part of the difficulty that I've dealt with my faith in medicine is, like, how do you reconcile those two things? Because, I feel like in the past, faith communities have had this idea that, oh, being faithful and living a faithful life leads you to the good things, and like having a sinful life or a bad life leads you to the bad things. And so I feel like a lot of my friends, just like they have trouble with that, like the rest of us do. And I find it hardest to even start a conversation with them around faith whenever they've kind of reached the point that they are unwilling to believe either way, because they've seen all these things happen to people who are good people, and often are just sort of the least interested or willing to enter into a conversation like the one that we're having right now. So yeah, how do you guys, I don't know if you guys approach in your work, any sort of almost evangelical, I think we would call it in Christianity, but like, how do you have conversations about your faith with people who are agnostic? I feel like it's harder than starting a conversation of somebody with a different faith, at least in my experience.
Dr. Kinghorn, I'll let you take that one first.
Yeah, I was hoping you would. I would say that just like anything, like if I meet somebody who says that they're a Christian, I try not to make assumptions about anything other than that they say that they're a Christian. I just want to know more. Like, what does that mean to you? Like, what kind of community are you part of or not? Like, what's important to you? And then the particularity begins to show. And so even more when somebody says that they're agnostic, like, I just want to know more. I try not to make assumptions, and I'm just very aware of what I don't know. But I do especially want to always wonder if somebody says that they're agnostic. I think people identify with that term for a lot of different reasons, but I would want to know what somebody's history with faith is. Were they raised in a faith tradition that then they've drifted from? Were they raised out of a faith tradition and they're like just not sure? Is it a kind of principled intellectual stance, or is it more like a sense of struggle and uncertainty? What's going on there? And I think that I think Christians learn this from Jewish people and from the Old Testament. But if the name Israel is one who struggles with God, like this idea of Scripture as this the prophets and even the very people of Israel, and continuing is like this ongoing struggle with, like, what does it mean to live as those whom God has chosen, and yet things are often really messed up, and what does that mean, and and so to read the prophet Jeremiah, for example, and to see this like chaotic heart cry to God of like that sometimes says like, God, you're punishing us. Sometimes says, God, where are you? Sometimes says, God, you're my greatest comfort. Sometimes promises good for the future. I think there's a room in the scriptures to to struggle. And so for someone who says that they're agnostic, if they're in a kind of position of struggle with faith, like we're in a position of having been wounded by a faith community, I mean, sometimes in very clear ways, like sexual assault or sexual abuse, or seeing that happen, or seeing, I mean, then I think that those wounds need to be acknowledged. I think that to the extent that those wounds are the product of a broken, sinful faith community, that needs to be acknowledged and named truthfully, and then trying to figure out, well, what does it mean for you to sit with these questions, and to try to hold out hope. I mean, as a Christian, I want people to see the truth and beauty and goodness of Christian faith, and to find a place in that. But I think that my role, not just as a psychiatrist, but as a Christian, is just to try to ask questions, try to hear, try not to make assumptions, and try to kind of hold out hope for people in that journey. Not so much to lead with telling people why they're wrong to be agnostic. That usually is not the first step I would take.
I agree so much with what you're saying, Dr. Kinghorn. Really, I think it's really important to figure out, particularly this concept of, and this is where I find people from faith traditions sometimes feel very uncomfortable doing what I think is actually a very important thing. In the course that I teach to our psychiatry residents, in the PGY 3 year, I teach a co-teacher course actually with another psychiatrist of faith. It's been really great having that, kind of friendship, as we've talked about earlier, but and different faith. She's Christian, and it's been really wonderful to have that co-teaching. But what I was saying was this course that we teach called Culture and Religion in Psychiatry. One of the main things that we focus on and have focused on for a number of cohorts now is this concept of religion that heals and religion that harms. And that's really hard sometimes for people from faith communities to hear, especially the second part. They're like, no, that's not the case. There's a lot of defensiveness, and it's exactly what you said, Dr. Kinghorn. We really have to see the person where they've come from and what their path has been. And sometimes it has been harmful, and we need to call harm for what it is, right? And understand that that's not necessarily a reflection of the faith itself or of God, but rather of the experience the person has had with people who clearly have misused and abused, that faith tradition. And it's been interesting. And sometimes that's the case, as you mentioned, Julian, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's really a person is really struggling, trying to understand, trying to really tie together what they have been learning. Think about that from kindergarten through that point in their life. They have essentially been taught and trained in a secular educational system that has questioned faith and God, and even demeaned it in many ways all the way through. So it's not very surprising actually to get all the way to this point, even as fellow physicians kind of just working and caring for the ill. And then you see these very terrible things happen, whether they're within the field of medicine or outside of it, and just grapple with what does all of this really mean, and how come this happens? Why do bad things happen to good people, right? That kind of concept. And here's where, even for people who are agnostic, or people even just sort of questioning whether within a faith community or outside of one, I usually share kind of my own understanding and perspective that comes and is drawn from my own faith on this. And this is where I'll turn to various Quranic verses and say, look, this is how I understand things to be. And you may not fully appreciate that or take that into your own belief system. But, in the Quran, Allah, or God, capital G, right, talks about how that this world is a world of tribulation. It's meant to be a place of tests and trials and difficulty. That's actually how the world is created according to the Quranic worldview. And God actually says in the Quran, do people think that just because they believe they'll be let alone by merely saying we believe and not be tested? Like, they're actually meant to be tested. We are meant to be tested in this world. And in a different part of the Quran, it actually explains what kind of tests will come, fear and loss of life and wealth and hunger and loss of lives and fruits and so on. And so because there is this concept of this is a world of tribulation, and what comes next is a world of, right, the hereafter is really a world in which there is no tribulation. That contrast, at least from my own perspective and for those who are within the Islamic faith, kind of contrasting those two is very helpful, because then you say, okay, there's something more coming and there's going to be better that comes after this. And even if a person who is not fully aligned with that belief system, it's still, I still find that it's helpful for them to really appreciate where I'm coming from. Like, why is it that I can look at the person or work with the person? Like, we'll use your case example, Dr. Kinghorn. It's 2:00 in the morning in the ED and the person has come in for the 30th time, right? And you're finding that within yourself, just finding a place of trying to be empathetic, right? Of trying to say, what if I was in that person's shoes, right? Which a lot of these really great character traits and moral teachings come from faith teachings. They really do. Although many times we tend to now secularize them and call it, oh, that's called empathy. You know, if you look far back enough into religious tradition, it comes straight out of scripture, right? Like, how do you do that for someone else? And so whether you use it from scripture or not, I think that concept of really putting yourself in the shoes of that other person, and if it helps to use scripture, I know I do quite a bit, and I'll actually share with others and say, look, you know, my belief system says, God says that he's not going to burden the soul more than it can bear, for example, right? Which is a very common Islamic saying, because it comes directly from the Quran, and Muslims will constantly say this and say, look, this very difficult thing is happening, but God is not going to burden us more than we can bear. And if he's brought us to this point, he's going to help bring us through it. And so let's figure out how exactly that's going to be. So I wonder if it's helpful to share what those worldviews that you hold are with others. And even if they don't fully align with them, at least they kind of see where you're coming from and just see a different way or different perspective of looking at things. And sometimes that's enlightening itself.
That was such a great answer. So many good things said from both of you. Specifically, that, yeah, I think the example of seeing, especially in sort of a psychiatric ED setting where it's so acute, kind of thinking of it in that setting, and not all of us have experienced that, but even, I don't know, I think that can also be applied to loved ones or people that you know, sort of doing the same thing over and over again. And you know, you're sitting here like, why do you keep doing this to yourself? We all see like how it affects you, and how to respond to that in a way that is constructive. It's so hard. But I think you make a great point that it is in a lot of ways comforting to fall back on the belief systems that you have, and to not try to create a new structure of understanding from your own self for those times that are just beyond words, that you're like, I don't even know what to do with this. And I feel like I find myself trying to reframe it in many different ways and create new structures of belief and understanding, when in reality, probably the more constructive thing to do is to actually put it in the frame that I already have for understanding the world through faith. So that was a big mind-blowing moment just now that I had. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah.
I'm going to move on to a question. Oh, Dr. Kinghorn, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Julia. I was just going to say, we have this federal law to the point of the person in the ER. We have this federal law, the EMTALA law, that basically says you can't deny care if somebody presents, you know, in an emergency situation for reasons of payment or anything else. And so, if you come to a ER in Austin or Durham, you're going to get cared for in some way. And I talk to trainees sometimes and say, like that law is an ethical decision. You know, it's a moral decision to do that. We don't have to have that kind of practice in the US. You could just be like, we're just going to have a hospital that only cares for people they can pay out of pocket, and anybody else can just go die on the street. And you might say we're close to that in some contexts and ways with healthcare disparities. But the reason that we don't have that is because we have these ethical traditions that, like, to be sick is to be worthy of care in some way. And even though probably nobody was thinking about this when they wrote the EMTALA law, like, this relates to, I think, the history of Christian and Islamic and Jewish ethics of, like, the dignity of the person. I mean, if these early Christians who were, you know, before the time of Islam, these early Christians who were learning from Jewish traditions of hospitality had not started welcoming the strangers who were sick into these infirmaries because they saw Jesus in the person who was sick, and founded these institutions that then started to care for people, not because they had social value, but because they were sick. Like, there's a direct line between that and our modern charity hospitals that, of course, had a lot of development in the Islamic world, and result, bears the result of all of that. But these are ethical decisions. These come from our traditions, and we can draw on that. Like, and that's right at the center of medicine. It's like somebody shows up in the ER, they need to be cared for, but we shouldn't take that for granted.
Yeah, totally. I just took a health law and policy class in the UT Law School this last semester, and we talked a lot about the Intala law, and it reminded me of that too. Just scripture about caring for the sick over yourself almost. Yeah, I definitely resonate with that.
Yeah, before you go to the next question really quick, you kind of alluded to this earlier, so I just personally wanted to say, like, I don't know, in the middle of this event, I was just feeling really grateful to have this experience where, like, we're getting to see faculty members represent their faith very publicly, and like the fact that you guys are here and doing that, because like Julia mentioned earlier, like for me at Dell, I'm the first hijabi student at Dell Med, and so that's resulted in like quite a few interesting experiences over the years, and that's, I, like Julia mentioned, I didn't realize when she said that was part of the reason that had kind of brought her here, in terms of the impact that experience had on her. But yeah, I think we had kind of discussed, I mean, you guys have kind of addressed this already about having that space for students and faculty, and certain ways to make that more apparent. And yeah, I don't know, like, this isn't a question or anything. It was just like a moment where I was just like, wow, this is pretty cool that we're actually having this from different campuses and being able to have this discussion. But go ahead, Julia, next question.
Yeah, no, this is the coolest. And I am so thankful that Maliha is here with me. We were just talking before this, we were like, we couldn't have done this without each other. So anyways, yeah, I completely agree and echo you, Maliha. This is a really cool experience to have with you and with our panelists. Okay, yes, so we had one question submitted by an audience member that I thought was really interesting, and this will probably be our last one to round us out. So I'm just going to read sort of all of what the student wrote, or the participant wrote. That's okay. So as an example of stigma concerning mental health, I've often heard growing up in my faith community that a majority of mental health issues are consequences of sin and maybe even demonic influence. With the understanding that many of these illnesses can derive from neurochemical imbalances, traumatic histories, etc., how do you reconcile between these two as practicing clinicians? This is something that makes me just a little apprehensive and sometimes seeking help for my own mental health, since I hear time and time again that people with mental illnesses are demon-possessed in my faith community. I don't want to compromise my beliefs, but at the same time, I don't want to mitigate the real impact that mental health certainly has. Also, I love that Dr. Awaad talked about cultural congruence instead of just competence. I agree, and I too agree on that. But yes, the question was, how do you reconcile between the two understandings of mental health as clinicians and as leaders in your faith communities?
I definitely want to defer to Dr. Awaad on this question.
Sounds good. I look forward to hearing what you would say too, Dr. Kinghorn. Definitely, this is what you're saying. The questions come through. It hits the nail on the head, really. And I realize this may be coming from other faith communities, but there's so many similarities. The concept of demon possession or sin, as being the result, is super common actually across many different faiths. And I would say it's very true even in the Muslim community as well. And so what have I done over time? Basically, one of the most important ways of addressing this that I found is really to explain how mental illnesses are multifactorial. And I think that's a really important word, because to come right out to somebody who is from a faith community, who has these beliefs and is part of their faith tradition, and to say no, and to just sort of like minimize that is not helpful in any way whatsoever. You've immediately lost rapport, and you would have a really hard time kind of regaining it. And so even if you don't fully believe in these constructs necessarily yourself, it's really important to understand where the person's coming from and allow that space. Now, if they are actually part of the faith construct of your own faith and your own belief system, so in my case, as a Muslim, if somebody were to say, jinn possession or demon possession, I would say, yeah, that's actually a construct in the faith, as in to say, in Islam, the beliefs that God created humans, angels, and jinn. Jinn are the, demons. And so, and I should say spirit. And so there's good and bad of them. And this concept of jinn possession, which again exists in many different cultures and faiths, does exist within Muslims as well in their Muslim belief. And so what I would often say when someone says, how do I know that's not just jinn possession? And you really want me to take this psychiatric medication? And so I'll say, well, how about we do this? How about we work alongside of each other, and you want to bring in kind of the faith aspect into it, and I want to bring in the psychiatric aspect to it. What if we do this in parallel? Because often what people in the Muslim tradition, if they believe that there is kind of some sort of possession, there is, and there are actually some Muslim faith leaders who will do, not exactly exorcism, but rather kind of read Quranic verses over the person. And in Arabic, we call this a ruqya. And that is something that comes directly from the faith tradition. And there's actually, historically, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, actually prescribed kind of the ruqya. So I'm not going to be one to say, no, don't read Quranic verses upon yourself. That's definitely in line with the person's faith tradition. And it doesn't get in the way, as long as we're working in parallel. It doesn't get in the way of what I could be doing, as long as we have this agreement, the patient and I, or in their family, that we can actually do this in parallel. So I'll often say, look, Imam so-and-so or Sheikh so-and-so has the ability to help you with the ruqya. I'm not trained in that specifically, but that if you want to see the Imam and have, him do this kind of recitation for you, by all means, let's do that in parallel with, if we can agree to do in parallel kind of the psychiatric treatment. And if you get better, excellent, right? And if you do one and you're not getting better, just the Quranic recitation of the ruqya, let's say, and you're not getting any better, can we have an agreement amongst each other that you will actually come back for care, or that I can continue working psychiatrically with you? One other thing that I found really excellent and helpful, and it's rare, is to find those imams who are willing to be psychologically minded, is the word I would term, right? And there's actually one that's right on my, speed dial, if you will, on the phone. And I'll say, Imam so-and-so is willing to actually do this. And he's been great, because he'll say, like, in his, this ruqya is something he inherited from knowledge from his father, who inherited from his father, it's like this long, lane of chain of transmission, if you will, of this Quranic recitation that he does. But he's also really great in saying, when he reaches his limit and says, what you have here is beyond what I can read for you and do for you. You need to go see the psychiatrist. And that's rare. Not every imam is ready to say that or do that. And so finding those, religious leaders who are willing to be aligned with you and say, look, let's do this together. Like, I will send people to you if they want kind of this Quranic recitation. And in turn, can you send them back this way if you feel that there is a need for this mental health, psychiatric intervention? And that's been a lovely partnership. It's been really great in that way. And I encourage that as much as possible. And so back to the questioner here, this concept of multifactorial has been really helpful and important, of really understanding that it's not just all neurochemistry either. There's also environmental reasons for mental health conditions. Think about people who went all through their life and didn't have any sort of mental health condition, but they went through trauma of war or of abuse or something that happened to them in the environment, and they then had PTSD, right? Like that's not necessarily neurochemistry, right? That's also environmental. So there's environmental, social causes. There are biological causes. There are genetic causes. There are also spiritual causes. So that concept of multifactor, and it could be a combination of, more than one of those. And when I kind of frame it that way, sometimes it's much easier to understand, because I'll say, look, I have seen people who are incredibly faithful, and people who I would say are my mentors and have been my teachers in faith, who have gone through terrible depression. And it's not for a lack of faith or a lack of religious knowledge, let me tell you, but in their case, it may have been something genetic, right? Whereas try as they might, that chronic depression keeps coming back. And that's been very useful too, to hear that kind of validation and understanding of how very multifactorial it is, and finding the right partners, if you will, within the faith community and within the medical community who are willing to work both ways, right? To partner both ways. So that's what I would kind of add to that discussion.
Yeah, that was a really helpful answer. I really agree about not reducing any mental illness to neurobiology alone, which is a separate conversation from that question. But I would just say briefly that I think Islam and Christianity have different theories of demons and demonology, but Christians themselves have lots of different approaches to demons and spirits. And so I can't answer for the whole tradition, but I will say what I believe as a Christian psychiatrist. One is that if you look at scripture, especially in the New Testament, and especially at Jesus' healing practices and how demons were present, first of all, the Bible does affirm the reality of these daimones, the demons or unclean spirits. I therefore also believe in the possibility of oppression and possession by demons. As a Christian, I have no reason not to do that. I'm not convinced that I've ever seen a clear example of that in my clinical practice, where in the kind of way that's classically described as a kind of demonic possession. But I want to be clear that I do believe that that's a possibility, and I believe that the spiritual world is real. But there's a few ways I think it's misunderstood. And again, speaking from within the Christian tradition here, that first of all, in the New Testament, the demons or unclean spirits typically don't cause what we would now recognize as mental illness. They typically cause like physical symptoms, maybe neurological symptoms, but it doesn't map very well into any of our modern conceptions of mental illness. So like when you think about like depression and long grief and anxiety, that's just not something that scripture characterizes in the language of the demonic. What the demons do typically is that they take people who are already vulnerable and they make them even more vulnerable to being on the outs of society. So they take people already on the margins and they marginalize them even more. And that's why they're these, and that's one thing to say. Another thing is that the demons were like, this was a world, the world of the first century when the New Testament was written, it was a world where it was just assumed that the world was pervaded with spiritual realities. And so the idea that that the demons were these spiritual forces out there in the world wasn't something exceptional. It was just the way that the world was. To breathe was to be surrounded by these spiritual forces. And so for Jesus, as the incarnation of God, who is affecting the mission of God on earth to come and to heal people, to cast out demons, was very much an affirmation that whatever the brokenness and evil and sickness and suffering of the world, Jesus is Lord over that. And there's no power that Jesus cannot heal. And so the healings are an anticipation of the coming reign of God. And so the last thing to say, and maybe the best story that might map onto our modern conception of mental illness was a story in the Gospel of Mark about this man who lived in the tombs. Jesus goes across the Sea of Galilee. He finds a man who's living in the tombs. He says, who's ostracized, who's like cutting himself and shouting. The man says, "What's your name?" And the man says, our name is Legion, for we are many. Jesus casts out these demons. They go into a herd of swine. They go over, those who knew the story, the swine die. The man goes back to his village. Like the people are kind of freaked out. They tell Jesus to leave the village, but the man stays there and becomes actually the first like missionary to the Gentiles. So it's a really great story how it ends up. But in that story, it's interesting that first of all, it's not clear that the man met our current criteria for schizophrenia. That's kind of a projection. The man, those does say, our name is Legion. And in the Greek New Testament, that name is written in Latin. And that was the name of the occupying Roman military force at the time. It would have been visible to the hearers of that story. The battalion of the Roman military that was occupying that area of Palestine at the time had a boar as on the crest of its shield. And so there's a way to read that story that is not just a kind of spiritual tale, but it's a tale of Jesus' authority over the dominant political empire of the time, which was Rome, and a statement that this traveling country preacher, rabbi, healer has power even over the Roman emperor and all of his military forces. And so when you start to think of demons in that way, demons aren't just like these like little spiritual creatures that crawl into people. That's more of a medieval, like a Christian medieval imagination. But they're these forces that take people who are oppressed and vulnerable, making them more vulnerable. Healing is restoring, is liberating people from those oppressive forces and restoring them to community where they can then have the kind of holistic life that God intends for them. like that's what it means for Jesus to be Lord over the demons. And so I think in that case, like we have to think about the demons as like it's a call to wholeness and a call to this work of liberation. So beyond that, I would just say that that's right. That I think if someone is worried about the demonic, I think thinking about like, maybe one can do something, you can engage with spiritual authorities and practices, but also take medication and then work side by side so they don't appear to be in competition with each other. With the goal that we all want healing, and we want, and in the Christian faith, in the New Testament especially, the word for healing and the word for salvation are the same word, the Greek word sozo. So there's this deep connection between to be saved and to be healed. And that's what Jesus' healing was a testimony to in Christian faith.